Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, hello and welcome to this midweek edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and on the show tonight...
Right now we are dealing with the immediate situation of ensuring that those who have lost their loved ones are comforted, they are accommodated, and they are well cared for.
A crisis of enormous proportions. That's how President Cyril Ramaphosa has characterized the devastation caused by floods in KwaZulu-Natal, where at least at the last count, 259 people have died and thousands have been left stranded, destitute, and desperate. But what is the government planning to do, and what can you do to help? We'll also hear from those affected, just how they have been impacted and what their needs are. Tonight's KZN Floods edition of the Watchdog starts now. The government is going to come to the aid of desperate communities ravaged by deadly floods that have affected many areas of KwaZulu-Natal. Well, that's the promise President Cyril Ramaphosa made today while leading a government-wide delegation that visited some of the communities. At least 259 people have lost their lives, while many more are still missing. Thousands have been left stranded and desperate as the floods ravaged homes, destroyed roads and infrastructure.
Just when the province of KwaZulu-Natal was getting back on its feet after last year's July unrest, it was dealt another blow. Severe floods have destroyed businesses and people's houses, leaving them destitute. President Ramaphosa, flanked by various officials, visited the affected areas like Umzinyati and Uzuma, amongst others. Nearly 300 lives were lost, including 4 children who died when a church fell on their shack, and families have been left devastated. Addressing the residents of Ward 22 in Claremont, west of Durban, Ramaphosa said it pained him to see what had happened and that government would support the affected families.
Into ebuhlungu kakhulu ukuthi kushone abantu abaningana. Izindlu zabo zibhidlekile, itrata, amabroho manje naleli sonto lela bhidlika.
Ramaphosa described the situation in KZN as dire and unprecedented. The floods have been labelled as the worst in the country's democratic history. 3 years ago, the province experienced floods during the Easter weekend, which claimed 85 lives.
Ngempela ngisibona sisibi kakhulu. Nehlelwe ingozi enkulu edlula nezinye ingozi esike sazibona. Isikhathi besicabanga nje ukuthi into enehlele la wonke lama district alapha eKwaZulu-Natal into ezenzeka mhlambe kwamanye amazwe.
Ramaphosa has assured residents that they are not alone and that government will be with them every step of the way.
Uhulumeni wonke uzobambisana izandla ukuthi sibone ukuthi lengozi enehlele ukuthi senzani sisebenza kanjani ukuncedisa abantu kakhulu laba abalahlekelwe izindlu, abantu abanayo nendawo yokuhlala. Sizoya kwenye indawo lapho siyobona abantu laba kufakwe khona eholweni. So yonke leyo misebenzi isayenza uhulumeni, sizayenza yonke indlela ukuthi sibone ukuthi sinceda kanjani. So sithi njengoba uPremier esho anihambi nodwa kule ndlela, sizawuhamba nani kule ndlela kule ngozi enivelele, sizawunceda ngazo zonke indlela esingakwazi ukuthi sincede ngazo.
Several schools have been closed. Meanwhile, the South African National Defence Force has been deployed to assist in the province. Natasha Piri, SABC News.
Natasha Piri on that visit by President Ramaphosa, accompanied by the Minister responsible for disaster management, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, as well as the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal and his provincial emissaries and officials, together with mayors of affected municipalities and their officials. But just how quickly is the help that the President promised today going to come, and what form is it going to take? We are still awaiting details of that, and from what we've just heard, the provincial cabinet is also meeting as we speak. That meeting is supposed to have started about an hour ago or so at 7 o'clock. We hope to get some details as to what it is exactly that it is planning to, it is discussing, and how all of what they will have discussed is going to really come to the aid of the people who have been affected by this disaster. And speaking of people who have been affected by this disaster, my first guest, Desmond Desar from the South African Durban Community Environmental Alliance, and Verushka Memdut, who is the chairperson of the Market Users Committee. Good evening to both of you, and thank you very much for your time this evening. I'm going to start with you, Verushka, if I may. Just tell us very briefly what your organization does. And represents, of course.
Good evening. Yeah, sure. Good evening and good evening to the viewers. Our organization is an organization that represents informal traders and market traders. So what we basically do is we assist traders in terms of achieving their desired outcomes through any lawful means. So basically we are a support group, and we work under the South African Informal Traders Forum nationally. We work in conjunction with the Durban Coalition of the Poor, and we ensure that the work and the efforts we make reaches the maximum amount of people in KZN. So at this stage, we have to look at ourselves in terms of leaders within the informal sector made up of markets, and street traders, vendors, you call them hawkers, the various titles given to people wanting to earn a living. And yes, this is where we find ourselves.
And how have they been affected by what we've been seeing over the past couple of days?
So at this stage, it's very difficult to assess exactly how they've been affected. But it's not very difficult to say that it has been devastating. Traders have not been at work. Very few have, if they have. And markets have been impacted in a large way, especially if I had to say the Durban National Fresh Produce Market. Traders that operate there have barely started picking up the pieces in terms of what work can be done. People have returned to work, mopping and cleaning currently. And I would say that it is unexpected. We don't know what to expect. In terms of the street traders in KZN, Durban especially, we've been having discussions around, have you seen X, Y, or Z person? You know, I'm not going to take any names, but we're still trying to identify the whereabouts of many traders. Traders have come or made calls, WhatsApps, etc. to us asking if we've been reached by people who perhaps were in need, are friends of theirs, neighbors who are trading. So at this stage, there's a lot of stock that needs to be taken in terms of actually assessing or explaining or reporting on the devastation and the impact it has had on the sector.
Desmond Desar, what does the South Durban Environmental Alliance do?
We're an environmental justice organization, preferably working with informal settlements, with the hostel dwellers, street traders, with fisher folks, and township people who are affected with the environment, but also around climate change. And we've been educating and advocating for a better, inclusive environment where people are part of the program in Durban to develop humane conditions for people to live in. We have warned the government repeatedly about climate change. We have put forward suggestions. How do we have a just transition so that jobs are not lost, and we move away from the causes of climate change, such as fossil fuels. And we are aware that our government has signed many treaties, the one in Paris as well as the one in Glasgow, where they have committed themselves to start moving away and moving to a just transition, that the harm that's been caused by climate change is addressed. I'm actually, written extensively 3 years ago about the climate, the rain bombs that we've seen. This one is worse than the one that we had over 3 years ago, when Cyril flew in from the World Trade Organization and said that he had to come here because over 70 people had lost their lives in that rain bomb that came down. This time it's much more, and as it stands now, it is very difficult to know how many people really that have lost their lives. We'll have to see when the waters have subsided, when everything starts clearing up, how many people have lost their lives. But certainly a huge disappointment in that the government of Cyril Ramaphosa and his cabinet ministers have not carried out the promises that were made over 3 years ago. People are still living in those inhumane conditions that resulted in them losing their lives and losing their only possession. Now it's gone worse. People have got nothing left. They've lost everything they ever owned. And these are poor people we're talking about. These are not people that can go to a takeaway and buy food. These are people that have had groceries, food that they buy for the month for their families. And they've lost all that they've lost all their clothing. So it's a tragedy that we didn't foresee, but I also think that the government, the warnings were there, the signs were there. We've had droughts, we've had rains, intermittent rains coming through in the province for quite some time now, since that episode that took place 3.5 years ago when President Cyril Ramaphosa came down to KZN and empathized with the people that lost their lives, and the government is going to support them. He said the very same rhetoric that he's speaking today, that the government is committed to supporting them and rebuilding their lives. But once the president and all the entourage and the media is off and the cameras are off the president, then everything is forgotten and those people living in inhumane conditions. And we know that over many years, people are living in transit camps. There's over 500 informal settlements alongside riverbanks, and people have been crying out to this government, crying out to the local government. And instead of the government listening and working together, people are being killed because they speak up about the conditions they live in. We've seen that in Ketamana. We've seen that all along the province, how people who speak up, who want to see a better life 27 years after democracy, want to see the promises that were made by our government being fulfilled. And we are seeing that things are getting worse with the conditions that we are experiencing now. These conditions are never going to go away. And the quicker and the sooner the government sits down with the citizens of the city, of the province, and of the country as a whole, the better is we'll come to find the solutions and work together. But if they want to come here, come with a big entourage and make promises, then it's not going to work, because the people are aware what took place over 3.5 years ago, that promises made, the same entourage, the same thing of government saying we are there, we will support the community, the people that have lost their lives, we'll support the families, we'll rebuild their lives, only to find that those promises are empty promises that are never being fulfilled.
Okay, we're going to, you're raising many issues there, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to get through all of them, or at least some of them. But Oscar, I want to come back to you. Desmond is talking about what happened 3.5 years ago, promises that were made that he says were never fulfilled. What were the experiences of the constituency you are representing, back then? If you can just, if you don't mind taking us back and tell us, what then happened after promises were made.
Okay. It's very simple. Promises are made and they're not fulfilled. So we're tired of this, as people on the ground. What we experience is, let me give you an example. Initially, we had COVID in the most recent past. We had COVID, and we were told that, okay, fine, now these restrictions are going to be put in place to help you. What did it do? It put us further into a poorer situation, a worse situation. And further to that, they were called restrictions, and then restrictions were uplifted, but then they call this thing the new normal. So even though they call support, are we actually receiving support? We have to think about this, and we have to think really hard and strong. Is the government actually supporting us, or are they using us to support a certain interest? Something we need to ask again. In July, there were riots and there was a little assistance that was shared out to a few informal traders or traders in markets. And yes, this was done, but how many people did it reach? How many people did it actually impact positively? How far did that in fact go? Whatever it was that was shared, did it in fact make an impact that could have changed something for many families? All of these questions must be asked. In terms of support, it's easy to say support, but do we reach it? Plans are put in place. Are these plans in fact effective? Have they been carried out, or have they just been talked about, showcased and, being said to have made an impact? Who is it that are party to these planning of projects, etc., to make an impact on us who actually sit on the ground? Are we part, or are we just called stakeholders? Are we referred to, when there's a disaster? But when do we become party to all of the planning, so that we know that what is expected to assist us, or what is expected to impact our lives, is actually something that is of value to us? As long as our voices are left out, there will be no value in what is shared by the government. I don't believe that. The government has to not only keep us in their thoughts, but very much so in their planning. A visit when there is a disaster cannot make, it doesn't make much of an impact. It's good that we see the leaders on the ground, but really we actually need to have them taking the message from the ground in their planning, so that their planning is effective. We cannot be using the top-down approach all the time. It hasn't worked, it has failed, and it's time that the message from the bottom up was used.
Now,
I hope that does answer your question.
Yes, it does, Verushka. Desmond, I want to pick up on what Verushka just said, and perhaps by way of a context, or in an effort to try and sort of bring our viewers along, talk to first what actually happened today. And as someone who have gone through this exercise numerous times before, you can then add your bit about what you feel is wrong with how the government does things. Verushka was talking about top-down approach. She was talking about people being left out. And I'm sure when you talk about the experiences of people who live in informal settlements, for example, you will tell us how things happen there. But I want to start here in a statement that was released a short while ago. The Department of Cooperative Governance, which as we know is responsible for disaster management, released a very short, test statement, even saying the head of the National Disaster Management Center has today, the 13th of April, in terms of Section 23(1)(b) of the Disaster Management Act 2002, classified floods experienced in KwaZulu-Natal as a provincial disaster. Statement goes on to say, the classification of the floods as a provincial disaster follows the recommendation and assessments done. And I want us to underline this, that they have done assessments, and based on the assessments that they made, came up with a recommendation by the Provincial Disaster Management Center, having seen the, wait for it, magnitude and severity of the impact of the severe weather events occurring in KwaZulu-Natal that have resulted in the loss of life and damage to property, infrastructure, and the environment as a result of the heavy rain, flooding, strong winds, and landslide. Having done that assessment, having looked at the magnitude and severity of what they have seen, they have come up with the recommendations that a state of provincial disaster, this should be classified as a provincial disaster. Now, you were saying earlier that this exercise has been done before. The last time it was 3.5 years ago, and it was done even like before then. What, in your experience, is the one thing that is actually wrong or problematic or inadequate with this process that this statement has just described, if anything?
Well, look, they've only gone to 2 areas. So 2 areas doesn't really tell the full picture of how devastating this has taken place. When we were going around the last few days, because we had to go to the areas themselves to check out what's going on, we found that 2 of the big refineries that are already stopped, they were all underwater. Workers at the refinery were there day and night, and they couldn't leave. They had to airlift them out of the refinery. So the refineries with dangerous chemicals are all flooded completely at a very high level. The water levels were very high. The Mlas Canal that runs into the Cuttings Beach in South Durban overflowed its banks, and it went over on the right-hand side into the Shell and BP refinery. The homes of people are devastating. There's so much that people have lost in the informal settlements because most of their homes are on low flood plains. They're alongside rivers and all that. They're not seeing that there. They haven't seen that, and they need to go and see that there. I was called quite a few times, even this evening, by the old age homes, the disability homes. There's no water in the city. All the water has been cut off from last night. There's no water, there's no electricity, there's nothing in the area. How do old age people in homes manage? So they're not telling the full story because they haven't gone around. Whatever the assessment they are doing hasn't got the full picture, because if it was that the full team of government officials on the ground, they would know what is going on. But
I mean, would they have to go there to know what is happening there? I don't need to go to an informal settlement to know how people live there. I mean, those people live with us. We've known this since. So isn't it a bit of, aren't we wasting time here by asking people to go and see for themselves? In fact, many people would say that even the tours, we saw today were probably a facade, because we know exactly how these people live when we're campaigning. During election campaigns, we know exactly the conditions under which these people live. So the issue here should be about what has been or is being done about their plight. To go there today because they have been hit by floods is a bit.
Well, I agree with that. I agree with that statement, because basically what they put out, what government has put out in the province, their assessment doesn't give us the full picture of how bad it is. It's really bad out there. When you drive around, you see it. It sort of comes up in your face. And if you can make it through the different roads, you are lucky. The roads are damaged quite well. The bridges have been washed off. As I said, we are getting calls from homes, old age homes, disability homes, that are saying we don't have water, and there's no water out the area. So people just don't know what to do. The important thing is nobody is corresponding. So after all this walkabout and this coming together of the president in the country with his ministers, there's no way that people are getting information of when is the water going to be come back, how far you are, what progress has been made, how big the damage is. There's nothing of that sort. So It's not taking people along with them. And they don't need to meet, and you're quite right, they don't need to go to those areas to see it. But at least they must communicate that. And then they must have an open line where people can call in and say, look, we are still waiting for water, or we have problems with this. They haven't even got a call center where people can call in to say that this is what it is. People were stuck at the old airport wheel yesterday on roofs, and they couldn't escape, and we were trying to get somebody to call in to say, look, can you send a helicopter to rescue those people? Who do you call? So that is the information that's not coming out from government. Right? That's not coming out at all.
Verushka, I mean, Desmond is making some suggestions here about how perhaps, the time could be better utilized. Of course, I mean, I was perhaps being a little facetious there. I was saying, there's no need. Perhaps there's value, in people seeing their leaders, empathizing with them. But again, I think probably in agreement with Desmond that there are better ways of perhaps utilizing, the time that our senior politicians have when disasters like these, hit the people. What for you could be some of the ways in which perhaps they could utilize a day like today, which they had or they had set aside to really, to attend to the people who have been affected by this, from a hawkers or informal traders perspective? What could the president and his entourage, what could they have done today or done better?
Well, I would have been very clear to say that in Durban we have the Durban Coalition of the Poor. The president could have sat with the leaders of that coalition and reached a huge constituency. I mean, all of us have a large number of people that we serve, and we would have given you the reports as required. Sometimes we speak of now the informal settlements where the leadership are going to visit. It bothers me. It makes me wonder, are they comfortable with these settlements being the way they are situated, where they are? Because there have been cries for many years. I mean, we know people have been killed for speaking out, but there have been cries saying, this is our plight, help us. We don't have running water. We don't have toilets. We're sitting on, we want formal housing. We want decent housing. We want toilets to go to. I mean, how serious has this been taken? I know as leader and as from working with other leaders within the coalition, we've been making these cries. We've been raising the volume. We've been having protests, marches, etc. Why is it that all of these things are not being addressed? It's just listening to the simple message from the people with constituencies that would assist the leaders today to make better decisions. And I believe that it's just, I don't know if it's about leaders being selective of who they listen to or who they hear, but I believe that there is a very big need for these leaders on the ground to do some introspection, to let them think about what impact they want to make and who they really want to impact. There is so much work that needs to be done, but inclusivity is a very, very large part of being impactful on a large scale. And it must be more than words now. We need to see actions. And yes, the president has come out, the provincial government have come out, they've shown themselves, but we want to see what work is being done, because we walk in those spaces all the time. To us, it's not a big deal. We don't see too much value in it today. We just say, okay, the president knows where we've stood before.
Community organization Abahlali Basemjondolo is also on the ground. Their General Secretary Thapelo Mohape spoke to our sister program Full View a little earlier, and listen to what Abahlali had to say.
Province in disaster. Yesterday we rescued a number of people in Tere State, where people who were their shacks along the river banks were actually washed away. We have a 3-month baby that was killed in Cato Crest. So we are indeed with a disaster. Right now, the rain starts and I'm looking up and I'm worried because in the community where I am, 2 informal settlements were washed away and people lost everything. People have no hope. People have lost hope. So I understand the frustration and the anger that people have because they know very well that even if there is budget that is allocated to this disaster, it will not end up to the people on the ground, which is why they wanted the president to go to the ground and understand the situation that people are facing on the ground. The only way that the government can understand the situation is when government goes and see where are the conditions which people are living under. People in the informal settlement, in the townships, in the low-cost housing, they are living on the banks. Their houses are just hanging, and anything from now on can happen if this rain continues. We've been here before. This is not the first time that we faced this situation, and we are calling upon everyone. I'm happy that the president is calling on us to work together. There's no time for politicking. We can't politic with people's lives. These are people's lives. We can't politic about poverty. People are poor. People have been living under these conditions. And it's unfair, unjust for a government that only comes to people when people are facing such a catastrophic situation. The government should be there to assess the situation from scratch. We need decent housing. We need decent housing now.
Okay. Desmond, he was really abahlali basemjondolo echoing what you were saying earlier. Thapelo Mohap is still hopeful that the government will get to listen. Are you as hopeful?
Well, look, I hope that the second visit by President Cyril Ramaphosa is not he had to make political capital out of it, that he's serious about addressing the inequality and inadequate resources that make people live in inhumane conditions. And since 2009, people are still living in transit camps. They were moved away from decent housing in Mlazi, and they were put at the bottom of the transit camps on floodplains, and that has continues to affect it. So I hope the president's visit is more than just a visit to show that he is here, so people must empathize and be happy that the president's visit. I think it has to be serious. It cannot continue. And I agree totally with Thapelo that, living in informal settlement. No, I'm talking from a point of visiting those informal settlements, seeing them being built on the banks of rivers, living in tent towns, in camps for so many years. Doesn't augur well for the future of themselves as families, but also for the future of their children and the generations coming after that. So I hope that Cyril Ramaphosa's visit is not to impress the political elites in KZN, but rather a genuineness that he's serious about addressing the poverty, the inequality, and the manner in which people continue to live in 27 years after our democracy in informal settlements, no access to water, no access to energy, no access to sanitation, living with rats and cockroaches. That is a tragedy of how people are living now in KZN. And I hope that he won't just come here for the visit, for only this visit, when the tragedy occurs, that he will make it a constant part of his presence and his determination and his program and plan to ensure that we eradicate informal settlements and give people dignity by building them proper homes and providing the necessary services that is required. There's enough land for all of us. It can't be that 27 years after that people are still struggling to live in inhumane conditions because the government doesn't want to allocate the land that is there and is reserving the land for a few people so that they can profit out of it. I think the time is right now for the country as a whole to come together and pressurize this government to make sure that the poor in this country are not left alone, but that we all come together and raise our voices, but also stand together to ensure that delivery to them comes now in our lifetime and not beyond that. Because I think it deserves it. It's time for the serious action that is required to address it. And we can't keep talking about this Rio. It's time now for this president to deliver on his promises that he's made 3.5 years ago and deliver on the promises that he's making now. If he doesn't come back, if he just stays away and it's forgotten, let me say that we'll be the constant reminder. We'll be the voices of the voiceless. We will stand up together. And if need be, we will fight together with the Abashali, with the Shack Dwellers movement in Durban, because we believe that our people of all races and all creeds and all colors deserve to live with dignity, and their children need to also live in dignity as well, like every other child in every other household. That is the time is now, and we can't really wait till millions of people are done. As the figure is rising, we don't know how many people have been washed away and lost everything. But we do know this has been the biggest devastation we've seen in a long time.
Varushka, last word from you.
I think I'm going to refer to a sentence or statement made in the statement of Abahlali Basemjondolo, and it said, "In this crisis, no one can be left behind." And I think I would like everyone who is watching your program today to share that word and ensure that in this crisis, no one is left behind.
That's where we're going to leave it with our two guests, Varushka Memdut and from the African Market Users Community, as well as Desmond Dessar, who is from the South Durban Environmental Alliance. But I wanted to have a look at this package that talks about the plight of a family in Utongati on the KwaZulu-Natal North Coast, struggling to come to terms with their loss of 4 of their members. A grandmother and her 3 grandchildren died when their vehicle was swept away by water. The youngest was just 4 months old. The grandmother was trying to cross a low-lying bridge when the incident happened.
The grandmother was transporting the children to her house after their home was flooded. She deviated from her normal route after the road they were using was flooded. The grandmother tried to drive over this bridge, but the river was swelling rapidly. The vehicle was washed away and they all drowned. Their bodies were found here.
On the route to Flamingo Heights, we had the water turning like a whale, like a puddle, and we had the storm waters that all was blocked, and that water, this like a tidal pool was there, and it just swept that vehicle into the small stream. When I say small stream, it's a very small stream. And that car was there. We couldn't see the car because it was quite late, and when we stood there, the water was above our waist level.
Munyen says the incident has left her traumatized.
There's no decent sleep because when I open my eyes, I can picture the baby. When I close my eyes, I can picture the baby. And you know, it's the baby that's I'm not going to forget. I had to pick up a baby on the floor.
Many affected families in this area have been left destitute. The local hall can't be used to house them as it's also flooded. The family was too distraught to comment. Londi Khadebe, SABC News, Tongati.
Londi there with one of many stories we've been hearing from people who have been affected by this disaster. Here's another one, another testimony, humanitarian organization Gift of the Givers, which is in the province trying to help with rescue efforts. Founder Imtiaz Suleiman on one of the situations they had to handle today. He was speaking earlier on one of our sister programs.
We're in a place in Durban North, and not realizing that this place are friends of ours. There is such a rescue personnel are trying to rescue a body. It happened on Monday night when the rains came. The boundary wall collapsed. First on our friend's house into the dining room, and then afterwards on the friend's neighbor's home. And when it fell on the second house, it fell on the room where the domestic was living. She got trapped under the wall of rubble and concrete and has been trapped there since Monday. The search and rescue team from the SFs have been here. They've been diligent. They've been working very hard. They've been working manually because right now the equipment that's required is in great demand throughout the province. Everybody needs the same equipment. Everybody wants to move rubble. Everybody wants to move sand. So they've been trying, and it's raining. It makes it much more difficult. It's raining right now. Every time you think you're making progress, it rains. So fortunately, we put a call through our social media pages and asked for a bobcat. And somebody came right now, but he has to find his driver. He has to find a tow truck to bring the bobcat here. It's still come here in the rain, but he's gone to try and do that. Once he was on his way here, the search and rescue personnel found a doll that belongs to, I think, the children of the domestic, and now they just retrieved a file. The file belongs to the domestic. It was given to them by the owner of the house. And it's a very emotional moment right now. And now, even in the rain, the search and rescue personnel are motivated because they've come so far. Remember in the beginning, they were not sure if they're digging in the right place because of so much rubble here. Were they in the right spot? And right now, they're almost confident they're in the right place and they should find the body soon, hopefully, if they don't have to go too deep. So the digging is carrying on whilst we're waiting for a bobcat to come around this house, to climb up on the sandbank. Otherwise, the neighbor's wall have to be broken down to bring, or even the garage has to be broken down to try to bring a machine through.
Imtiaz Suleiman, founder of the Gift of the Givers, giving you a sense of one among many cases that they have to deal with as they assist in the mop-up operations, but also as they try to help people cope better with the situation that they are finding themselves in. Earlier, my colleague Mlondi Khadebe, taking us through what happened to that family that lost 4 people, a grandmother, together with 3 of her grandchildren. There are many such stories and worse. Hopefully, the help that President Cyril Ramaphosa promised is going to come sooner rather than later. And just a note to say that we did reach out to national government as well as the provincial government to get a sense of when this help is going to come, in what form is it going to come, how can other people, the rest of us, really help, in the efforts, and how can we avoid, such situations in future, which is what I'm going to talk about next with my next guests. Some insights into the kinds of weather patterns that have caused this KZN disaster and whether these situations can actually be avoided or at the very least mitigated. That's what's coming up in a moment on the other side of this short ad break. Well, we are now joined by James Rilla, who is a climate specialist from the Worldwide Fund. Good evening, James. Thanks very much for your time. There's a couple of stories which we didn't have time to play, from our reporters in the Eastern Cape and in the Northern Cape, where there are heavy rains, but perhaps not as devastating as what we are seeing in KwaZulu-Natal. As people who have been studying this, climate change, what is there consensus? That's how I should put it. Is there consensus among scientists as to what is the cause of these kinds of devastating weathers we're experiencing now?
That's an interesting question. Certainly there is consensus about what are the drivers of the extreme events. In this case, a lot of it is driven by this La Nina, which is a current in the Pacific that basically is a periodical cycle. And so we have an increased likelihood of these sorts of extreme events when that is occurring. And that's a natural cycle.
What are the causes?
Question you're really asking is, are we seeing the fingerprints of climate change in this? And I think that certainly, again, there is consensus that is happening. There's a whole science devoted to trying to work out the attribution, how much of this is specifically what we expect in the natural conditions and how much is it exacerbated by the sort of the drivers of climate change? And certainly the constant heating of the oceans and the constant heating of the atmosphere that we've been putting, that we have been driving as humans is exacerbating these effects. They're more likely and they're more intense typically, and we can expect that to increase in the future.
Now, I've lost track of the COP numbering. Year in and year out, there are these big conversations that are being held by all the important people in the world, including presidents of our countries and some of the best brains that this world has. Why aren't we moving with greater speed, towards eliminating what we are seeing, or at least doing the kinds of things that need to be done to, mitigate or stop what the devastation we are seeing?
So that's a very good question. There's two elements to addressing the impacts. One is obviously this concept of mitigation, where we're trying to reduce what's driving it. So our burning of fossil fuels primarily and conversion of land, those sorts of things put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and they exacerbate climate change. And there's our global economy is predicated on this freely available energy. So the transformation, whilst it's entirely possible, requires a rethinking of how we do things, and major transformation of our energy systems. And so there's a lot of historically political resistance to this, and we're now living with a situation where it's still feasible to make the necessary changes, but the urgency is much, much higher.
I thought the attitudes had changed, but what is at issue is the power relations between and among, the world's nations and continents and so on. In other words, those, the poorer, people of the world feel that they are being made sacrificial lambs by the rich and mighty. They are being made to make more sacrifices, whereas the rich unprepared, to get rid of their old ways.
So that's exactly right. I think that we're seeing that the nations that are most responsible for this and the people that are most responsible for this are the ones that are holding the power largely. And the impacts of climate change are primarily going to be felt by those who are poor and who are vulnerable, and so they're most at risk. And the issue about sort of fair shares and equity, about who's responsible, who moves, has been a major contention point throughout the history of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is those COPs that you're speaking about, where they're making the negotiations around climate change. And so the second element about climate that we need to do, we know that we've got change coming down the pipeline. We know we've had change, and we have to undertake what's called adaptation, essentially trying to deal with the impacts. And the people, as I say, who are most at risk, and as has been demonstrated here, we've seen the informal settlements have been hit much more the people in the settlements have a much larger impact on them, basically because they're in more vulnerable areas, they have less resources to fall back on, they're more marginalized. And we see this across not just within nations, but actually between nations to some extent.
James, hopefully things are going to change for the better, but we have to end it there for this evening. James Rilla, who's a climate specialist with the Worldwide Fund. These issues are big, these issues are important, but resolving them is not as easy as we would all want them to be. But that's our show for this evening. Do enjoy the rest of what is left of your evening, and wake up tomorrow morning and get ready to join us again tomorrow evening, same time, 8 p.m. sharp.